In this episode, we focus on a topic that sounds like corporate vocabulary until you realize it is the invisible force behind many everyday decisions: risk appetite and risk tolerance. For brand new learners, risk often feels like a technical issue that security teams handle or a legal issue that compliance teams worry about. And it can be surprising to hear that leaders must define how much risk the enterprise is willing to carry. The reason leaders must define it is simple. If nobody sets the boundaries, teams will guess, and guessing produces inconsistent behavior. Some teams will become overly cautious because they fear blame, while other teams will take big risks because they feel pressure to move fast. Risk appetite and tolerance are governance tools that turn those guesses into explicit expectations, which makes decisions more consistent, more explainable, and easier to enforce. In this lesson, you will learn what appetite and tolerance mean in practical terms, why the difference matters, and how leaders make these boundaries real rather than symbolic. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Risk appetite is the broad statement of how much uncertainty the enterprise is willing to accept in pursuit of its objectives. It is a leadership choice, not a technical measurement, because it reflects strategy, market position, obligations, and culture. A growth-focused enterprise may accept more uncertainty around experimentation and rapid change, while still being strict about protecting customer information. A highly regulated enterprise may accept slower delivery and higher control overhead to reduce compliance risk, because the cost of failure is unacceptable. Risk tolerance is more specific, describing the acceptable level of variation or exposure within a particular area, such as how much downtime is acceptable for a critical service or how much deviation from a standard can be allowed before escalation is required. Appetite sets direction, while tolerance sets boundaries that can be measured and enforced. Beginners often confuse these terms because both involve acceptance, but the distinction matters because governance needs both a strategic compass and operational guardrails. Without appetite, tolerances can be inconsistent, and without tolerances, appetite stays vague and unenforceable. The phrase "leaders will enforce consistently" is where many organizations stumble, because writing down appetite is easier than living by it. Enforcement depends on leaders treating risk boundaries as real constraints, even when enforcing them is inconvenient. If leaders declare that customer trust is a top priority but then reward teams only for speed, teams will learn that the real appetite favors speed even when it increases exposure. Consistent enforcement means aligning incentives, funding decisions, and escalation responses to the stated boundaries. It also means leaders accept the consequences of their own choices, such as funding the controls needed to meet strict tolerances. When leaders demand strict tolerances without providing resources, teams either fail or create superficial compliance artifacts. Governance credibility depends on this alignment, because people pay attention to what leaders do, not just what leaders say. To set appetite and tolerance effectively, leaders must begin with enterprise objectives, because risk only has meaning in relation to what the enterprise is trying to achieve. If the enterprise objective is to deliver reliable digital services that customers trust, then tolerances for outages and data exposure must reflect that objective. If the objective is rapid innovation in a competitive market, tolerances might allow more experimentation in low-impact areas while remaining strict in high-impact areas. This is where beginners should notice that appetite is rarely uniform across everything the enterprise does. Leaders often set different appetites for different risk categories, such as operational disruption, confidentiality loss, fraud, compliance failure, and reputational harm. A mature approach recognizes that the enterprise can be bold in one area and conservative in another, depending on what matters most and what constraints exist. The result is a more realistic and enforceable set of boundaries, because it matches how enterprises actually make trade-offs. A practical way to think about tolerance is to connect it to measurable performance and exposure indicators, because tolerances must be observable to be enforceable. For example, a service tolerance might be expressed as an acceptable range for downtime, or an acceptable range for time to restore service after an incident. A control tolerance might be expressed as an acceptable percentage of systems that can be out of compliance with a critical control requirement before escalation occurs. A third-party tolerance might be expressed as limits on the number of critical services that depend on a single vendor without a contingency plan. These are not implementation steps. They are governance guardrails that can be measured and monitored. When tolerances are measurable, teams can manage within them, and leaders can see when boundaries are being approached. When tolerances are not measurable, enforcement becomes subjective, which tends to produce inconsistency and political conflict. The next concept beginners need is that tolerance should be set at levels that are meaningful and realistic, not at levels that sound impressive. Saying the enterprise tolerates 0 incidents or 0 downtime may sound strong, but it is often unrealistic, and unrealistic tolerances lead to hidden failures. Teams might underreport incidents to appear compliant, or they might avoid needed change because any change increases the chance of temporary disruption. In both cases, the enterprise becomes less safe and less resilient. A better approach is to define tolerances that reflect what the enterprise can support economically and operationally, and then invest in capabilities that improve performance over time. Tolerance can also vary by criticality, meaning a customer-facing revenue service might have a tighter tolerance than an internal reporting service. This is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of prioritization. Governance is about making choices that fit reality while steadily improving the enterprise's ability to manage risk. Enforcement consistency also depends on escalation and exception handling, because tolerances are only useful if there is a clear response when they are exceeded or when teams need a temporary deviation. When a tolerance is breached, the organization should have a defined path for escalation, including who must be informed, what decisions can be made, and what corrective actions are expected. Without a clear path, breaches become normal and tolerances become decorative. Exception handling is equally important because real work often requires temporary deviations, such as delaying a control improvement due to a dependency or accepting temporary exposure during a transition. Consistent governance allows exceptions, but requires that exceptions be documented, time-limited, owned, and monitored. This prevents exceptions from becoming permanent loopholes that undermine credibility. When leaders enforce exceptions consistently, teams learn that governance is practical and fair, which increases cooperation and reduces friction. A subtle but important element is aligning appetite and tolerance with how the enterprise measures and reports risk. If leaders cannot see risk posture through meaningful indicators, they cannot enforce boundaries reliably. This is why organizations establish risk reporting that includes trend, direction, and key exposures, not just static lists of concerns. Reporting should be tied to the tolerance thresholds so leaders can see when exposure is near limits and when action is needed. It should also avoid overwhelming leadership with operational detail, because leaders need decision-ready information. When reporting is aligned, enforcement becomes proactive rather than reactive, since leaders can intervene before tolerances are exceeded. This supports risk optimization because the enterprise can adjust investments, processes, and controls to stay within boundaries while still pursuing objectives. In contrast, when reporting is disconnected, enforcement becomes crisis-driven, which is where inconsistent decisions are most likely. Leaders also need to understand that appetites and tolerances influence culture, because they shape what behavior is rewarded and what behavior is discouraged. If leadership sets a strict appetite for protecting customer data, teams should see that reflected in funding for strong controls, in praise for preventing exposure, and in serious responses when boundaries are violated. If leadership sets a higher appetite for experimentation in low-impact areas, teams should see that reflected in support for controlled trials and in a learning-oriented response to minor failures. Culture becomes confused when boundaries are stated but not reinforced, because people then rely on informal signals like which projects get funded and which managers get promoted. Consistent enforcement reduces confusion by turning boundaries into predictable expectations. Over time, that predictability builds trust, because teams learn that decisions will not be reversed randomly or based on politics. Trust matters because risk management requires honest reporting, and honest reporting requires psychological safety. Another beginner misunderstanding is to treat appetite and tolerance as paperwork created once a year and then forgotten. In reality, appetites and tolerances should be reviewed when major conditions change, such as entering new markets, launching new digital services, acquiring another company, or experiencing a significant incident. These events can change the enterprise's exposure and priorities, and governance must adjust boundaries accordingly. Adjusting does not mean overreacting to every event. It means calibrating based on evidence. For example, if incident patterns reveal that a service is more fragile than assumed, the enterprise might tighten tolerance for downtime and invest in resilience. If market pressure demands faster delivery, leaders might adjust appetite for change risk in certain areas while reinforcing strict boundaries in high-impact categories. The key is that changes are deliberate and communicated, not accidental. When calibration is deliberate, enforcement remains consistent even as the enterprise evolves. To make this concrete, imagine an enterprise that relies on an online ordering service for revenue, and leadership states that customer trust is central to strategy. A meaningful tolerance might include limits on unplanned downtime and limits on certain types of high-impact failures. Leaders would then fund resilience improvements and insist that major changes follow appropriate oversight, because those actions align with the stated appetite. If a team wants to bypass controls to deliver a feature faster, consistent enforcement would mean leadership rejects the bypass or requires an approved, time-limited exception with compensating measures. Over time, the enterprise would observe whether performance measures remain within tolerance and whether customer impact incidents decline. That feedback loop turns risk appetite from a statement into a lived practice. The outcome is not perfection. The outcome is predictable, explainable risk trade-offs that support strategy. As we wrap up, setting risk appetite and tolerance that leaders will enforce consistently means defining clear boundaries for acceptable risk, connecting those boundaries to enterprise objectives, and ensuring enforcement shows up in decisions, funding, and accountability. Appetite provides the strategic direction for how much uncertainty the enterprise will accept, while tolerance provides measurable guardrails that teams can manage and leadership can monitor. Consistent enforcement requires clear escalation paths, practical exception handling, aligned reporting, and incentives that match the stated boundaries. When leaders enforce consistently, risk governance becomes credible, and teams stop guessing what is allowed and start making decisions that fit the enterprise's chosen trade-offs. If you remember one core idea, let it be that risk boundaries only matter when they shape real choices, because enforcement is what transforms policy language into enterprise behavior.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.